Hey friends, I'm Sakay, and today we're going to continue building the Animal Crossing database that we started in the last video. If you haven't seen that, definitely recommend going back and watching it. But if you have and you're following along, you'll remember that in the last video, we built this little card. It's got a hover interaction, and it looks just like the card that we designed in Figma in the first video. Also recommend watching that. And what we want to do today is to start pulling in some real data from the Animal Crossing API, populate these cards with that data, and then loop over an array to generate a card for each of our villagers. So rather than one card, we're going to use Alpine and loops to create a whole bunch of cards for each of the villagers in our data. As mentioned in past videos, this is part of a larger series. So if you want to follow along and see all of the videos in this, definitely hit the subscribe to get notified when my next video goes up. And with that said, let's get into it. So last time we built this card using Tailwind CSS. You'll see here that we have all of our markup laid out. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is actually pull in the data from the API so that we can work with it and populate this card. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file in here. I'm going to call it data.js. And in this new file, we're going to create a data function, which returns some data. So let's get into that. So I'm going to do const data equals, and we're going to return object called data. And this object is for now just going to say villagers, which is going to be an array. So this might look a little verbose right now, but what we want to do is return a data object that can then store all of the various pieces of state and data that we want to use in our UI, which in this part is just going to be this villagers array. But in the next part, we are going to actually open a sidebar. And so we're going to need to keep track of if the sidebar is open and what the active villager is so that we can display their data in the sidebar. For today, we're just going to have an empty array here called villagers. So I'm going to hit save. And then right after our data object, we're going to write an init function. This init is a lifecycle hook from Alpine, and essentially it tells Alpine to run all of this code before making any updates to the DOM. So we want to actually pull in all of this data before it starts to populate the DOM, otherwise we're going to get empty elements in our DOM. So in our init function, we're going to fetch from our villagers API. We've talked about this at length before, but as you can see, we have this link that just pulls in a list of all of the villagers from this API. And then we're going to take that response and we're going to return that response.json so that we can actually manipulate it and do things with it easily. So if I then do data, let's just console log that data. We're then going to return this so we can actually see what's going on. But if I head in here and refresh, you'll see that nothing shows up in our console. Of course, if we want any of that to work, we're going to obviously import our data.js JavaScript file, as well as Alpine from the CDN. So let's go over to Arc, and you can see here in the AlpineJS documentation, they've got this script line that we can import. So I'll do that, paste that in here. And then right after that, we'll do another script where the source is our data.js. Now, the last thing we need to do to actually use this data function and the init function that we just wrote is to go into the grid over here, the grid that contains all of our cards. And we're going to do xData equals our data function. This is sort of like the data object that you have in Vue. It's essentially telling Alpine that everything within this div needs to be reactive to whatever's happening in this data and has access to that data and can make use of that data. So now if we hit save and we head back to here, you'll see that we are console logging this object. This is a giant object. It's the exact same thing that we were seeing in the last video in Insomnia. And of course, each of them has, an ID, they have names, there's this object within it, a bunch of properties that we can make use of to then populate here. But before we do that, the last thing we want to do is take this data and actually add it to this array so that we can easily access it in our code. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take our data and we're going to say this dot data dot villagers needs to be equal object dot values as data. And we're just using this to basically take this object, which we're getting back from the API, and turning it into an array that we can iterate over to generate all of those cards. So now we have access to all of our data in here. And of course, the first step is to iterate over that array that we just created to generate one card for each entry. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to create a new template tag. And so when we loop in Alpine, we always need to use a template to wrap all of the content that we actually want to loop. So I'm going to write template, and then I'm going to move this entire card. This is our villager card, and we're just going to move it up inside this template. So you see here, the template closing tag is here, open tag is there. And if we hit save, it's in here, and it's kind of broken. And the reason is because we actually need to take this template and do something with it. So we're going to write x4, which just creates a for loop using Alpine. And we're going to say x4 villager in data.villagers. So what we're saying here is this is your typical for loop. So if you've worked with loops in JavaScript before, this will hopefully make some sense. Also, if you've worked with Vue, this looks a lot like Vue, but we're saying that for each element in this data.villagers array, create a new template, duplicate this template. And villager is going to be the name to which we can access the data of each of these iterations. So now if we save it, we'll see that it's generated a whole load of cards for us. But of course, these are still using that static data that we put in the last video. So go in and actually replace that with the data that we can use. So the first thing we see here that we want to change is the icon, this image here. So instead of using icons at villagers at 1, which is the first icon of this first villager, we're going to use the actual icon that is returned from the API for each of our villagers. Now I'm going to open Insomnia again. This is just going to make our lives a lot easier. We'll be able to see what the API returns, and so we can use that to populate our data. For example, I know that out here I want the icon URI. That's what we're using. And so all I have to do is, instead of source, I'm going to add a colon before it to say that this is a dynamic. And then in here, we'll use villager.icon_URI. See it in here. And if we go back to Safari, you'll now see that each of the icons is the appropriate icon from that villager. If we scroll down, all of the icons are unique and they're being pulled in from the API. And then we're going to keep using that concept to populate the rest of our data. So the next thing I see here is the birthday. So this span is not going to be 9x3 anymore. Instead, we're going to use x text to equal, let's look at Insomnia, villager.birthday, birthday. And once again, we can go back and check, and we'll see that the text is in fact the villager's birthday. They're all different. And now the next thing we want to do is pull in those colors that are going to help us style these bubbles to match the color of the villagers in the game. So in the last video, as I mentioned, we put this in a style tag instead of pulling it into the classes, so that we can now add a colon to it to tell Alpine that this is dynamic, this is going to have some JavaScript in it, and to use that JavaScript to populate this. So all we do is wrap these in curly braces, and then I'm going to put background color in quotes so it understands that it's not a variable. And then instead of the background color, we're going to use the bubble color. So we'll say villager, and because there's a hyphen in the middle, we're going to have to use this type of notation, and we'll say bubble color. Let's hit save, and we might get an error. Yeah, we get an error. That's okay. Let's go ahead and do the same here for our color. And just like that, villager at text color. Hit save, okay, and it's still not working. So I can see that it says unexpected error, semicolon. This is actually supposed to be a comma here. And now if we do that, we see what we were expecting, which is for the bubble to pull in the color and the text to pull in the text color as well. And so now it matches kind of the style of that villager. So the next one is going to be pretty easy. We're just replacing the name here. So just like we saw before, we'll use x text. This is our directive for creating text. And instead of ace, it's going to be villager dot name, and then within the name we'll want to use the US English name. So villager.name, at the name-usen key. Yes. We can remove this from here, and perfect. As expected, all the names are being pulled in. Next one is we're actually going to have to do a little bit of logic. So we want to display the male icon when the gender is male, and then the little female icon when the gender is female. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use the xShow directive. So I'll go in here and I'll just type in male. If I scroll down, I can see the little male emoji symbol. And I'm going to duplicate this. And here I'm going to place the female symbol, which is this. And essentially we're going to show this span if the gender is male and show this span if the gender is female. The way we do that in Alpine is with the xShow directive. So we're going to xShow this when villager.gender equals male. And then the other one we're going to xShow when villager, not village, dot gender equals female. So let's hit save and take a look. We can now see that when a villager is a male, it gets the male symbol, and when they're a female, they get the female symbol. So the last couple of things we need to do is their personality and their species. And so I'm going to invite you to quickly pause the video and try and use some of the stuff that we just learned to do this yourself. So we want to replace the text here to, instead of being jock hard-coded, we want it to be the villager's personality. And instead of bird, it should be the villager's species. You can see here, we have the species and personality properties that we have access to. Let's go ahead, pause the video, give it a try, and come back. Okay, so hopefully you gave that a shot. Let's see how I'm going to do it. As we've learned, I can use the xtext directive, and we'll just need to use the villager.personality. We can remove this. And here, xtext, we'll do villager.species. Let's hit save and see if that worked. Awesome. See cranky anteater, a jock bear, a peppy bear, and so on. And finally, we want to take their catchphrase and display that between quotes. So in here, I'm going to do xtext. And this time, I'm actually going to do a template literal so that we can put the quote between quotes. So I'm going to do a quotation mark, and then I'll do $, open bracket. This is the kind of JavaScript template literal way of saying what's in here. It needs to be interpreted as JavaScript. So we'll do villager at catch phrase. And outside of the curly brackets, we'll put another quotation mark. This needs to also be in quotes since it's the name of a key. And now all of our catchphrases are in here. So we now have a list that's pulling that data in from our API. It's generating a card with all of the appropriate information for each of these villagers all the way down. Of course, this isn't the best experience. You'd probably want to paginate this, provide some search functionality, anything like that. But for today, I'd say we're pretty happy with that. And in the next video, we're going to actually create the interaction where if I click on one of these, it opens up a sidebar and provides a little bit more information structured in a different way for each of these villagers. Again, we're going to use Alpine to do all of this programmatically, so we only have to do it once, and then we can loop over it for each of our villagers. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video, hope you learned something, and if you did, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It helps me out, and it helps you see these videos as they come out. As always, if you want to get the code for this video, you can get it on my Patreon. All of the code for the previous videos and all of the working files for all of my tutorials are available on the Patreon. And of course, it helps me out and it helps to support the channel. So with that said, hope to see you in the next one, and until then, happy designing.